A warm welcome to everyone. My name is Alex Gomez Marin, and I'm the director of the Paris Center. And we are really thrilled and blessed to host this very special event in collaboration with Channel McGilchrist, Perspectiva Press, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Arthur Conan Doyle Center. Today, we will reflect on Iain McGilchrist's book, his magnus opus, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, on the occasion of the first anniversary of its publication. The structure of the session will be the following. We will start with 45 minutes with a 45-minute interview by Jonathan Rowson, the co-founder and director of Perspectiva, followed by 1 hour conversation with a group of distinguished panelists who Iain will introduce individually later. And we will end this 2-hour event with some Q&A from the audience. So please post your questions in the chat. And at the end, we will select and read a few of them aloud for Iain to answer. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Jonathan. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alex, and lovely to see such a full Zoom room, which has many layers behind the one I can see, 500 plus at the moment. It's a testament to Iain's great work and the enthusiasm the recent book has generated. I'm Jonathan Rowson, director of Perspectiva. We sometimes describe Perspectiva as a way of giving social and intellectual permission to reimagine the world from first principles. It's really about a kind of collective spiritual encounter with the precarity of this historical moment and the attempt to find our own individual path through that encounter. And with that in mind, Iain's work, of course, fits beautifully. And we were very, very proud to publish The Matter with Things. Tonight, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual, which is to assume 1 year into this book being published, that the basic thesis that went into the prior book of The Master and His Emissary, which is consolidated and extended in volume 1 of the new book, is taken as a given for my 45 minutes. I'm conscious that we have a panel coming up with neurologists and neuroscientists who will probe more deeply into brain-related issues. But in order to get a focused discussion with Iain, I'm going to focus instead on chapters 20 to 28, which is I think, the particularly original contribution in The Matter with Things. Of course, there's a great deal of new material and new argumentation that's of enormous value in the first volume. But to focus the discussion, I'm also going to ask Iain in a minute to not to overly argue the case of each point developed in each chapter. What I'm really interested in is the morphology and the sort of narrative arc of the second volume, in which Iain moves from beginning with the coincidence of opposites and ends with a sort of vision of the sacred. And he goes through the one and the many, time, flow and movement, space and matter, matter and consciousness, value, purpose, life, and the nature of the cosmos, and then the sense of the sacred. So volume 2 is really a metaphysics. Now, most of you, I'm guessing, want to hear about the hemispheric hypothesis. I'm going to take that as a given tonight, which is not to say you can't ask about it later. And I want to draw attention not just to the hemispheric hypothesis on the one hand, but also what I'm beginning to refer to as the McGilchrist maneuver on the other. And the McGilchrist maneuver I see as a kind of underlying structural form that characterizes the second volume of The Matter with Things. And it's broadly the shift from a sort of either or view of the world, a sort of slicing and dicing, choose A or B, to a kind of both and, no, let's include everything and everything's the same. And Iain's quite keen to say that neither of these are quite true, that actually we need both and either or. And this statement a version of this statement can be discerned in almost every part of volume 2 of the book. Iain refers to it in a more spiritual context when he speaks about we need to get not only non-duality, but the duality of non-duality and duality. And there's several different variants on this theme. And I want to focus on this because in some ways, many people have asked Iain about the sacred, and we could reflect on his theology and his panentheistic view towards the end of the book, but I'm more interested in how he made that argument. For me, the most important chapter, or possibly chapters, of the 2 volumes are chapters 20 and 21, because it's there that he bridges the argument from the hemispheric hypothesis that most of us here will know about the different patterns of attention of the 2 brain hemispheres, how they give rise phenomenologically to different ways of being in the world, how they co-arise and inform each other. And he moves into a more philosophical take on this being this form of perception, these competing modes of attention that co-arise, being a kind of feature of reality as such. He speaks of the first 2 chapters of volume 2 in terms of the processes by which reality come into being. So Ian, that's the setting. That's what I want to explore with you. I really want to understand how you got from chapter 20 to 28. I want to understand, in effect, you present a vision of the cosmos that's not one of dead matter and accidents, but something deeply imbued with time, value, meaning, purpose, the sacred, and more. And I want to sort of begin by allowing you not to restate your argument in volume 1, and to take that as a given for the purposes of these next 40 minutes or so, and focus instead on, if that's the case, how did this argument play out in volume 2?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You've set out a not negligible task, which I will try to address best I can. Incidentally, I know it's annoying to be corrected, but just in case anybody thought that I meant the duality of non-duality and duality, I meant the non-duality of non-duality and duality. But no, it's fine. Yes, I think that you're right. That I hadn't really thought about it much, but I think that those first 2 chapters of the final part of the book, part 3, which is the metaphysics, are important. And I think one of the key things that we miss in the world that we now construe for ourselves is the way in which opposites cohere, and the way in which they do so, and the relationship between unity and multiplicity. It sounds rather abstract like that, but it plays itself out in many ways in our lives all around us. So, for example, the simplest example is that we think that opposites are at the far ends of a linear pole, which is very much the sort of imagery that the left hemisphere uses to understand things. But in fact, the problem is that the more you move down towards one of the extremities of this pole, trying to get closer and closer to something that you value, the more you find yourself besieged by the very thing you were trying to get away from. I now think this is what Lewis Carroll, who was an utterly brilliant philosopher, was getting at the beginning of Alice Through the Looking Glass, I think it is, where he has the Red Queen say to Alice, she said, "I'll go there directly." And she said, "If I were you, I wouldn't do that. I'd go in the opposite direction." Because if we were once to see that, as I put it sometimes, every angel has its devil, and every devil has its angel. In other words, things that we think are good have their downsides that we're not attending to, and things that we think are bad have their upsides that we should do well to attend to. That would make an important difference to the way we see the world. But I want to say something about the way in which these relate, because exactly of the way in which we now think, it's hard to understand that when one says the coincidence of opposites, this doesn't mean in any way a diminution of their opposition. So the job is to show that they both coincide and are indeed opposites. Yeah. And it's holding the tension, as so often, between two things that we conceive of as being incompatible, and not saying, well, it has to be this or it has to be that, but it can't somehow be both of these. Time and again, and certainly throughout part 3, which is the second volume that you're talking about, I imagine, come back to this theme. I think I do in several ways in relation to all the phenomena that you described. And it's this tension of holding the two that is so difficult for us now, because it sounds as though we're saying something that is self-contradictory. And it seems that we're happier being completely wrong and consistent than being thought of as being inconsistent, and showing that there are two things we need to hold together. The image that I use here, somebody's got their not unmuted, so could you mute yourself? Otherwise you get feedback down the line. Thank you. I mean, the image that I often use here is that of Heraclitus is the taut string of the lyre that gives rise to the note, the taut string of the bow that gives rise to the power to fire an arrow. These things pull in opposite directions, but both need to be held. You can't get rid of one or the other.
So yeah, so I wanted to draw attention to what I think might be my favorite line in the whole book. And everyone will have their favorites, but it hit me like a kind of juggernaut, because you mentioned already about, for every devil there's an angel and vice versa, but you're also very keen, and this is why I began with the McGilchrist maneuver as I describe it, because you say in the book, I think you're referring to William James at the time, but still it's your own language. You speak of the equal necessity but unequal status of spiritual opposites. The equal necessity but unequal status of spiritual opposites. So when you say that every devil is an angel, you're not saying the devil's as good or as important or as significant, but you're saying nonetheless it's there. And that seems to arise figuratively at a kind of structural level, almost isomorphic with the hemispheric hypothesis.
That's a good point. The opposite is necessary and cannot be done away with. Yeah. And yet one of them is greater than the other. I mean, we live in a society where the prejudice is that if there are two things, they simply must be of equal value or importance, but this is not necessarily the case. And in physics, it's clearly not the case. And I think in the realm of philosophy and spirituality, it is not the case. So I had a very interesting conversation with the physicist Geraldine Cox about asymmetry and symmetry, something that people will know I talk about in the book, and I've also talked about in seminars that are online. But the important thing is that asymmetry is more important than symmetry. This was pointed out by Louis Pasteur in the 1870s in relation to life. And it was a point also made by Pierre Curie about 20 years later in relation to the existence of matter at all. That both of them said that symmetry is unimportant, but the existence of asymmetry is absolutely essential to the existence of anything or to the existence of life. And this essential cosmic asymmetry is what is imaged everywhere. And of course, we know in a sense, to bring it down to a relatively simple idea, that it is the initial inequality between antimatter and matter which enables there to have been a cosmos at all. But the point I'm making in asymmetry and symmetry is that asymmetry can embrace and include fruitfully symmetry, but symmetry cannot embrace and include asymmetry. And in the book, I give two, I think, rather beautiful photographs. One of the front of the library, Jefferson's Library at the University of Virginia in the 18th century, Enlightenment building, which is symmetrical and simple and beautiful, and was based on the Villa La Rotonda, which is actually outside Vicenza, Palladio's masterpiece, which is fundamentally symmetrical, but has wonderful asymmetries within it, which bring the whole thing to life. Right. So, and this is also imaged in the great art of, for example, Japan and of other cultures. And there are others that are like this. I think that, for example, and the one that you're probably pointing to here, is that evil and good are not in this sense symmetrical, in that good can embrace the resistance and hatred of evil, but evil cannot embrace the goodness and togetherness of good. Right.
And so this is where I wanted to focus on this, because it seems that this kind of structure of something like opposites, principles of resistance, nonetheless mutual and sort of reciprocal relationships happening throughout the cosmos at different levels, having some major moral and spiritual significance about how reality is and how we should potentially live our lives. I wanted to just propose to you how I saw it in terms of this sort of run through, and I'll do it in a very sketchy ways, and you can maybe fill it out. But it's very interesting that you begin with the coincidence of opposites, as if to establish something about why the hemispheric perception, so the hemispheric hypothesis carries on as a sort of underlying, not just a kind of epistemological point, but more a sort of ontological feature of reality. And then you move on to the one and the many. And the purpose of the one and the many, I think, is also the general and the specific. And again, there's a kind of echo of the hemispheric hypothesis, because you're speaking about the right hemisphere perceiving uniqueness as something sort of precious, whereas the left hemisphere tends to reduce down to some generalization. And then you move on through time, and you see time not primarily, but one of the things about time is not only a process view and a sort of view of time as flowing, but time being critical both for individuation and the creative act. And then if you'll just bear with me for a second, because I'm coming to the question, you then move into flow and movement, which was again a somewhat surprising thing for me when I first read it, that you had set aside so much time for flow. But your point is not that there are things in life that flow, but that life as such is flow. And you argue that in this chapter. And then you move on to space and matter. And it seems the point there is, I mean, I say the point, one of the points to try and tell the story of how these chapters relate is that space gives the perception of depth, crucially. And also there's something about, you say that consciousness is not in space, but it is in time. And that seems to be a rather crucial point for grasping what consciousness is. It's not in space, but it is in time. And then you go on into, theory of consciousness, and then you get to value, purpose, and the sacred. What I really want to ask you is, you set it up beautifully, and you bring together things that people might be surprised by. For example, space and matter have a chapter together, and matter and consciousness, less surprising. But there's a moment between chapter 25 and chapter 26 where you move into value and a kind of teleology, and then the sacred. And around there, I imagine someone who hasn't been paying attention might say he's making the classic Izot fallacy or fact-value distinction. He's moving from a kind of descriptive ontology to some kind of normative view of how the world is. Is your view which one of the following is closer to your view? Is it something like it's difficult for the right hemisphere to explain something to the left hemisphere when it doesn't want to understand it, and it's just self-evident to the right hemisphere that things are this way, like a mother holding a child is beautiful, is of value, a tree, a sunset, these things are given, they're intrinsic features of the universe, they have value. Is your view that it's just self-evident and something that reveals itself to us? Or is there a way that you can actually mobilize some sort of left hemisphere-like argument to make that case? Or is that kind of missing the point, and it's better just to reveal what is the case? Because you seem to, there's something happens there, Ian, I think, because you get to the sacred and everyone's like, well, not everyone, I know you've had some critical feedback on this, but there's something very beautiful happens around chapter 25 to chapter 26, where you're going from neurology, epistemology, a kind of descriptive ontology, a kind of metaphysics, and then boom, suddenly we're in a world of intrinsic value, meaning and purpose. I want you to talk us through what happens there. How does that shift occur?
Yes. I'm not sure I have actually, or I'm not aware of having received anyway too much criticism about it, but I certainly was advised ahead of time by some people I respect, certainly not to include a chapter on the sacred, because they felt that there was philosophical depth or richness in what I had expounded, and they thought that that would immediately turn some people away and say, oh, well, it's a hopeless case, he's a faith head sort of thing. But I didn't feel happy with an account of what there is that, takes on topics as big as time and space, but doesn't take on the sacred, but also the ideas of value in itself and purpose. I was encouraged by the fact that a colleague of mine at Oxford, Derek Parfit, who was a very famous philosopher, considered one of the greatest of recent decades, who was an atheist, himself believed that values were ontological primitives, that they weren't made up, but that they were, as it were, part of the structure of things. There are a number of things to say about that. I mean, again, I can refer to philosophers, Max Scheler, who made the rather interesting point that value may be rather like our perception of color, that we don't make an assumption and test it out and calculate that this is blue. We see it and then we know it is blue. And in German there is a word, Wahrnehmung, which means perception.
Right.
And he created a word, Wertnehmung, which is valueception.
Valueception.
It was like perception. And what we know about the right hemisphere, and this is in part one that I won't go to on your advice for the moment, or just because we don't want to use up too much time on that tonight. There, I think I demonstrate with a colossal amount of evidence that when it comes to things like attending to the world, perceiving them and rightly judging them, the left hemisphere is inferior to the right. So the right hemisphere apprehension that there is value has been taken by the left hemisphere as, well, prove it. It must be of utility.
Right.
And then you get what seem to me enormously jejune arguments in favor of goodness, beauty, and truth based on the idea that they are useful in some way.
Right.
And I mean, we haven't got time to go through, that's an hour's talk in itself, and one that I have given actually at PARI. But the point, I think, is that it's manifestly unsatisfactory to anyone who isn't already completely mind closed on this, that these things must show their utility. Even Darwin was completely baffled by beauty. He saw perfectly well that it can be used once you have beauty in order to guide mate selection, but he made the point that seems to have been missed by so many people coming after him, that we haven't any idea where beauty itself comes from. And he returns to this puzzle at least twice, to my knowledge, in the literature. And he talked about beauty an enormous amount. Every other page of The Descent of Man literally has the word beauty or beautiful on it, which is not what you find in his philosophical descendants. So I think these things have been sidetracked and sort of dismissed because they don't fit into the overall utilitarian calculus. Right. And philosophers are embarrassed about that. But they're enormously important. First of all, perhaps the ultimate test of the reality of anything is the appeal to experience. You can argue anything you like, but if in the end it doesn't really square with your experience, that is the final test of any kind of argument towards truth, whatever school you belong to, which is why I myself admire the pragmatists, which effectively are saying something of this kind. Right. But certainly in my experience and the experience of many people that I've got to know, and some of them through my profession as a psychiatrist, I think these things are enormously important, give meaning and seem rich, and are only uncovered if you approach them and are open to them. There are certain things that you will never find if you. It's rather like the image of Simplicius sitting on the bank of the river, learning how to swim before he gets into the water. But you can't learn how to swim until you get into the water. And these things demand, in that sense, an openness to experience that's very important. And they color so much of the way in which we think about and decide about the courses of action we should follow and the way the world is going. So I think actually covertly people think these things are incredibly important. And people say to me, thank God somebody is at last talking about these values. The other one you mentioned is purpose. And if I can just quickly say about it.
If you don't mind, we'll come on to that in a second. But for those who are wondering, this term valueception, I just want to state, yes. I know you took it from German.
Yes, okay, it's fine.
I believe it first appears on page 1131 because I looked into it prior to the call. It's a mind-blowing concept again, because it's a subversive, transgressive idea in some ways for the world as we find it. Because what you're effectively saying is, just as time and space may be ontological primaries too, and if I try and throw a can in the bin. I have to make judgments about time and space and assume they're real to get it right. But you're saying something similar is the case with value, that there is a kind of intrinsic, implicit grasp that value is already somehow there. And by the way, can you help us here with the elision between value and values, and what might be confused by that elision? But I am keen to hear more about valueception before you come on to purpose.
All right, okay. Well, just to reassure you, valueception does come up in part 1 of the Master and His Emissary as well. So I have given it a fair old airing in the past, but it may well not come up until the chapter on value in The Matter with Things. That sounds about right. On the distinction between value and values, I mean, I'm making this distinction that what we value at any one time in any one place may well vary. So people's values in that sense can be said to be somewhat societally determined. However, by the way, this is grossly overestimated, so that I spend some time showing that actually people from quite different cultures see usually the same things as beautiful or ugly, and make the same judgments about pieces of music and so forth. Generally speaking, have similar ideas about goodness. They may vary on certain ways in which it might be lawful to kill somebody or not. But generally speaking, most people don't think that murder and rape are a good idea, and so on. So that would be the values thing, whereas value is the whole, which comes back to valueception, that we have a faculty which is able to discern these values, and it comes about very quickly. Goethe, as you know, because I make the remark more than once, had this, I think, brilliant idea that something that important in the world gives rise in the individual to the faculty with which it can be properly appreciated. Right. So that, in a way, the growth in us of a faculty is caused by the perception there is something there that we need to contact and be able to assess. And I think this is true of value. It's hardwired into us in that sense now. And infants, even at 3 days, will gravitate to looking at beautiful faces that have been judged to be beautiful, not just in their own culture, but by people in other cultures, faces in other cultures. So there's something quite down to earth and simple, basic about the need for beauty, which guides us towards many things. It's complicated, and I show that truth and goodness and beauty don't always necessarily completely coincide, which is why we have different concepts. Right. Interestingly, Goethe. Yeah, go on.
Well, I'm keen by the end of our time that people have a feeling for the full reach of the second volume.
Sure.
And like I say, at the beginning, chapters 20 and 21, the coincidence of opposites and the one and the many, I feels like a kind of shift from epistemology to ontology, but in a similar kind of structure. And then you move in to describe, a sort of process theory, a sort of theory of time as flowing. You make flow a fundamental feature of reality. You investigate space. You speak about matter as critical for resistance. You get into a theory of consciousness, which is a kind of panpsychism, although with your own caveats there. And there's somewhere around the end of the consciousness chapter where you describe, I think if I'm right, I've got written it down here, if I can read my own handwriting. You say at the end, I believe that what exists is, you speak about a field of potentiality. And that you speak about this field of potentiality as giving rise to the capacity for value, which is kind of the comment you just made, that there's something about the nature of the field of potentiality when you perceive it in a certain way. You see that what it's for, and this brings in the sort of teleological dimension, what it's for is the capacity for value. Because I want people to feel that when you land up on the sacred at the end, you didn't just tag it on, right? It wasn't as if, oh, let's say something about another important question. I very much felt as I was reading the book that I was being led from first principles in neurology, perception, intuition, imagination, reason, through the different institutional faculties of science and so forth, art, etc., to this sort of shift towards ontology and then a shift towards metaphysics. And within that metaphysics, you move from value as fundamental purpose being baked into the cosmos, and us here as mere human beings somehow in some resonant relationship with reality, in which the point of our being is not to utilize or, you know, utility maximization, but something more about rediscovering the sacred relationship that's already there. And I just want to encourage you to sort of, you may not remember because, you know, you've spent so much time in the details of each of these chapters, but there's something really beautiful that happens in the second volume, in which the sacred is sort of brought into being. So by the time you get to chapter 28, you're already there. There's a sense in which, of course, the sacred. It's not at all that you tacked it on. Is that your impression, or have I just made that up?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think sometimes somebody who's outside the process can see more of what has happened here than the person who's in the middle of it. It doesn't surprise me what you say. In fact, it pleases me. I think one way of talking about this is that the discovery is not simply a linear process, this bringing of something into being. It's not a linear process in which one thing is established and another is added and so on, but it's more like a sort of going backwards and forwards between part and whole, which we actually know is how the right and left hemisphere operate.
Like Blake's ladder or something.
Sorry?
It's a kind of, you mentioned Blake's ladder elsewhere. This
Yes. Well, that's one way of looking at it. It's that, and it's the sort of bringing gradually into focus of something as more and more of it is seen. It doesn't, as it were, chain. It contributes to, and you see which way this picture has to be crystallized.
Right.
And so I think anyone. That's why in the note to the reader at the outset, I sort of suggest that I hope it will be a bit like a journey, and that's really what you're saying, that you gather things, you see what the implications of this, and it leads in a absolutely reasonable way, a rational way, but not by simple steps of logic, but by a picture that, as it were, comes more and more into focus and becomes richer and richer. And I see the cosmos itself as A.N. Whitehead. Whitehead was a great philosopher, and nobody can say that he, the co-author of the Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, was somehow off on a cloud. I mean, he sees these spiritual realities extremely clearly. Right. And his vision is that whatever the divine force, the logos, the li, the rta, whatever it is that's in the cosmos that creates, is in communion with, or in commerce with, or doing a sort of dance with, a relationship, and in any case with whatever it is that's coming into being. And that coming into being is both informative and creative for that force itself and for what is coming into being. Right. So that force, that perhaps divine, whatever it is coming to know more of its own infinite potential as it is realized and precipitated out in the process of individuation. Right. So there is always this process of individuation and the process of union. And once again, this is an unequal pairing, in that union will always unify the individuation with the integrity of the whole, not render them separate. So it's another instance of that, and that's a theme that comes back again and again. But this, is it better to go to resistance or to go to purpose, or where would you like to go now?
I think I want to go to the sacred, just because I'm conscious we have just over 5, maybe 7 minutes left. All right. Because I think the listeners can now take it as a given that there is this kind of argument unfolds in the second volume that leads up to a take on the sacred, and you described it as panentheistic, and this is a term of art, technical term. Talk me through that, and how does it arise from the prior? I'm particularly interested to understand, because the reason, if we could speak to the motivation behind this question and my decision to focus on this part of the book, I guess I'm also trying to get at whether the other way of viewing the universe, and there's more than one, of course, but the reductionist view that you take issue with right at the start of the book, saying this is kind of your target, this is your enemy, maybe not enemy, but certainly your target, the reductionist view that thinks we're just sort of dead matter in a meaningless cosmos. And you go step by step to explain why that's not really a reasonable view. And your reasonableness takes you, after 600,000 odd words and lots of footnotes, to a view of the sacred that is panentheistic. So I just want to hear your view of what panentheism means to you, and for the listeners to realize that it doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes out of the preceding argument.
Yes, it does. But again, I want to make a very clear distinction that nobody needs to think that they're going to have anything religious rammed down their throat at all, not even in the chapter on the sacred. And I don't really talk about anything religious up until that chapter. I think what you're pointing to there is that I'm unpacking, I think, a richer, more complex, more sophisticated view of the world than that of reductive materialism,
Right.
and that it is in keeping with three very important sets of findings. One that I expound at great length is neuroscience. Another is physics, in which I'm not an expert, but have been advised by a number of physicists who've approached me and said that my work in the Master in His Hemisphere was very interesting to them. And the wisdom traditions, if you like, of both East and West, they reach very similar conclusions. And at the moment, we're seeing a change in philosophy in which panpsychism is enjoying a revival. And even in biology, which is the most recalcitrant and mechanistic of all the branches of science, paradoxically, because it ought not to be, we're seeing changes. So when we come to that chapter, what I'm talking about there is the non-reduction of the idea of the divine to the sum of bits that we're aware of, which would be pantheism. So pantheism is more, if you like, comfortable to the left hemisphere trained mind. It says, okay, well, if you want to call this assemblage of bits God, I'm not going to stop you. And I'm saying, no, you've missed the point. There's something much more here, which is not just in this material. And in fact, in a recent talk, I mentioned the way in which music is not just in the sounds. A poem is not just in the words. And a painting is not just in the frescoed wall where it stands. It is something else, which is actually the beginning of an experience. And that experience is an encounter. So it requires something other. And the whole idea of there being something other is essential to my argument. I don't fall into either the unfortunate positions of a naive idealist that it's all just made up by my brain, or a naive realist that actually my brain has nothing to do with the existence of what's out there. So that's a constant theme. But what I'm suggesting is that in panentheism, which means that God is in everything and everything is in God. In other words, God is not exhausted by the sum of all those things, nor is he restricted by his presence in all those things to them being a description of what he is. So it's a bigger and broader, a more capacious, more evolving position. And a theologian called Moltmann actually wrote about panentheism as a way of understanding the Trinity, which I think, I won't unpack it here, but I do in the book, which I think is quite interesting because, I spent the first 40 years of my life thinking, well, there are a lot of balmy things in religion, but the Trinity's got to be one of the balmiest, as they say, the man, the boy, and the bird. But I now realize so many things that have come to me in the last 20 years, the richness and wisdom of things that I dismissed because I didn't really understand them.
Mm-hmm. So I have more to ask you as always, Ian, but I think I'm inclined to leave it there. The only thing I wanted to probe you with, and you can choose whether to answer or not, is
we've got a few more minutes, I think.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're a scientist, so if the audience will permit me, it's an interesting tension because you are a scientist and you've built your reputation on the quality of your scientific inquiry, and your premise about the hemispheric hypothesis is, although it's philosophically informed, it's primarily a sort of scientific case that it builds on. And yet you end this monumental inquiry in a view of the sacred. And you've also mentioned valueception as a kind of key feature of what it is to be human and to understand the argument that you presented. But you're keen not to be religious. So all of that seems to be, not to be advocating religion or to be seen that somehow that's implicit. But I just wonder how easy that is for you, because where is valueception? You mentioned the wisdom traditions. Part of me is feeling like, there might be all sorts of atrocities in religion in the past, and many good reasons not to go hook, line, and sinker into organized religion.
Absolutely.
We all know that. Nonetheless, is there something about the nature of your argument landing up in the sacred, having come that long journey from the science through the philosophy, that points towards something about what the future of religion has to be, or at least the future of spiritual practice and the institutionalization of that, and the enculturation of that? What does that look like if we're to survive and thrive as a species that looks like it might be foolish enough to destroy its only home?
Well, I don't know what it will look like. I think, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is a difficult thing, especially when it concerns the future. So I think I can honestly say that it's probably a mistake to try and predict, but I can make some remarks in that direction. Hello? Somebody's speaking, I can't hear. Perhaps they didn't mean to be on. What I would say is, first of all, that there is absolutely no necessary divorce between science and philosophy. Exactly the opposite. Science without philosophy is weak, possibly dangerous. And this is a point that was also made by Whitehead, that, their divorce has been a disaster, both for science and for philosophy. So I'm constantly saying to philosophers, but actually you do need to look at the science. And I'm constantly saying to scientists, but you can't just naively assume that what you've got here is a fact that, just is another piece of a datum. We actually have to be able to understand the whole that we're contributing to.
But I guess,
Sorry, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, just to be more precise about the question, many of your speeches, as many of the audience here will know, lament the state of the world, and you're often very articulate, but also quite emphatic that this is a world gone wrong, a world in risks destroying itself through its own hubris.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes.
However, you're quite right not to prophesize what the future will be, and you're also quite right not to have bullet point answers about what we should do. Nonetheless, I do want to push you that you're arguing for the importance of recognizing a different view of reality. You said yourself the key is a new form of perception, and a key aspect of that new perception is the intrinsic value that you've mentioned in this notion of valueception. We need to come to see the beauty and glory and gratuitous gift of the world. However, I'm kind of pushing you on give us some sense of how that manifests, because in the book, in volume 1, you do speak of how the manifestation institutionally of these forms of inquiry, but now you end the book, and I'm wondering how that manifests now, or maybe that's for the next generation to answer, but I'm keen to know your thoughts on it.
Gosh. And I mean, one starts having to say rather simple things like we need to change education, which we certainly do. And, I won't go into that because it's kind of dull and lots of people have said it, but we need to rehumanize it. We need to change the nature of public discourse so that we are actively encouraging the values that I'm talking about, the openness to the idea of connection, kindness and love, rather than vilification, narcissism, self-righteousness. We need to shift to one in which we understand the awe that we can experience and all have in us to experience if we will allow ourselves to feel, to experience it before the natural world. All of these things are militated against by various aspects of modern society. I have to take that that people will know why that is the case. But I think that we can encourage these values. We need to take truth more seriously, and it's not good enough for people to dismiss science and hard science because it doesn't fit with their philosophy. And this happens among scientists and it happens among postmodernists. And both of them are eager to go, oh, well, it's not very convenient for us, so we're going to say it's not good science. That is not good science. We can't do without reason. You know, I'm passionate about reason. I've written thousands of pages of well-reasoned, I believe, argument. So I'm not saying that these things are not valuable, but I think we need to reconnect ourselves with things like great art, the natural world, and the spiritual realm, not cut ourselves off from them. And they can only be understood if you make the move towards them. They won't come and get you out of bed in your, in your left hemisphere apartment somewhere.
That was the fire I was looking for, Ian. Thank you. The movement towards the things that you described.
Yes, but I do want to say, yes, that what I have to say about the relationship between that sense of the sacred and religion is, I think I finesse it. I think I finesse all these things. And what really grieves me is that when I say something briefly for the purposes of something like this, I have to vulgarize, and people will sound like I'm trying to push a religion. I'm not.
I think you're among friends here. No, really, I think you're among friends.
No, and I'm not dismissing religions either. I think they play a very important role. And I talk about their virtues and vices. And I'm certainly not, a card-holding member of anything particular, although I happen to think that the Christian mythos is enormously potent and incredibly moving, actually, and it deeply speaks to me, and so does Buddhism, and so do parts of the Vedanta and so on. So and all these traditions actually encompass far more than we now hold. Even of Christianity, there's a trend in early mysticism in Christianity which would understand all the chapters of part 3 of my book, even though they're about things that probably weren't much debated at the time.
Great. Well, listen, thank you for enduring my questions, and
thank you.
Another chance to talk again before long. I think, yes. Alex, I can pass it back to you and to the wonderful panel you've assembled.